front door creaked open as Clarence stepped into his home, the place that had once been his sanctuary. Now, it felt like a battleground. The air was heavy with an unspoken tension, the walls seemingly closing in on him. He wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe it was gradual, or maybe it had always been this way. But as he walked through the hallway past the photographs of happier times, Clarence couldn't ignore the growing unease in his chest. He felt like a stranger in his own home. Clarence, now in his early 70s, had spent his life working hard, first in the factory, then whatever odd jobs he could find. He had raised his son with love and dedication, teaching him what it meant to be a man, to honor family and work for what you wanted. But lately, Clarence had begun to feel as though his efforts had been in vain. His son, though polite, was distant. The real problem, however, was Lynette, his daughter-in-law. She had become more than just a nuisance. She had become a daily reminder of his own obsolescence. He stood in the kitchen now, watching Lynette bustle around, her voice cutting through the silence with an air of authority. The tension was palpable. It had been this way for months, maybe even longer. Clarence had never been one to speak up, to challenge anyone, but the weight of it all was starting to crush him. He didn't want to be here anymore, not in this house, not in this life. He wanted something to change, but he didn't know where to begin. Lynette's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and impatient. "Clarence, you're in the way. I don't know how much longer we can keep you here. You're just a parasite living off us." The words hit him like a slap across the face. He hadn't expected it, but it was a blow nonetheless. He felt a heat rise in his chest, but he bit it back as he always did. He couldn't respond. He didn't have the energy to argue, not anymore. He had learned long ago to keep his head down, to endure, to be the silent presence in the background. "I'm just a burden, huh?" Clarence murmured under his breath. His voice was low, more to himself than to her, but the pain was evident. He could feel the sting of the words, even as they bounced off him. Maybe she's right, he thought. Maybe he was just taking up space. He had no real purpose anymore. Lynette didn't wait for him to respond. She was already walking away, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Clarence stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the kitchen counter. The weight of her words echoed in his mind. It wasn't the first time she had insulted him like this, but it was different this time. Something inside him shifted. He didn't know what to call it, but it was there. A flicker of anger, of defiance. For a moment, he wondered what it would feel like to scream, to tell her everything he had kept bottled up for so long. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded. It was easier. Easier than fighting. Easier than confronting the truth. But the anger festered, bubbling just beneath the surface. Clarence retreated to his chair, the one by the window where he spent most of his days, watching the world go by. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the living room. His mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions. He was tired. Tired of being overlooked. Tired of the way his family treated him. Tired of being a ghost in his own home. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in a deep breath. His body was old, but his mind was still sharp. He had always been a man of action, of doing what needed to be done, but now he felt paralyzed. He couldn't move, couldn't speak out. But that night, as he sat there in the quiet house, Clarence began to feel something he hadn't in years, a stir of determination. Something had to change. He couldn't continue like this, living off his son's charity, ignored and belittled by the woman he had once trusted to care for his family. He wasn't just going to sit by and let her dictate his worth anymore. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Clarence realized something deep within himself. He had been silent for far too long, but silence didn't work anymore. Silence had kept him small, kept him invisible. Tomorrow, he would speak. He would take back some part of himself. He wasn't sure how or when, but he knew it had to happen. He couldn't live like this anymore. I nodded, he thought again, trying to hold on to my dignity. But that night, something inside me started to break. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room. Clarence sat in his usual chair by the window, looking out at the world going by, but feeling more disconnected from it than ever. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet for comfort. He hadn't heard from his son all morning, and Lynette had already left for work. Clarence was left alone with his thoughts, his mind replaying the events of the previous day over and over again. Lynette's words still stung like fresh wounds. "You're just a parasite living off us." The insult echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls, getting louder and louder with each passing hour. He had spent his whole life trying to provide for his family, to ensure his son had everything he didn't. But now he was nothing more than a burden, a ghost in his own home. It had been a slow, quiet descent into this position. At first he had brushed it off, the way his son was always too busy to spend time with him, the way Lynette never looked at him like she used to. But yesterday, that final blow from Lynette shattered the illusion that he still had a place here. He hadn't reacted. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't stood up for himself. No, he had done the thing he always did. Nothing. But this time, it was different. This time, Clarence felt something stir inside of him, deep in his chest. It was quiet at first, just a whisper of something rising up from beneath the layers of years of frustration. But it was there, and it was growing. Clarence's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. He didn't need to look to know it was his son. He had heard the familiar creak of the door hinges, followed by the soft shuffle of shoes on the floor. Clarence sat up a little straighter, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Maybe today would be different. Maybe he could talk to his son, tell him how he felt. Maybe he could finally be heard. But when his son entered the living room, he didn't speak. He didn't even look at Clarence. The distance between them had grown so vast that Clarence could practically feel it in the air. His son was distracted, his eyes glued to his phone as he walked past, heading straight for the kitchen. Clarence sighed, his heart sinking into his chest. He had spent years raising this boy, teaching him what it meant to be a man. And now his son couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge his existence. But then Clarence realized something. He had spent all this time pretending that his silence would keep the peace, that his passivity would somehow make everything okay. But it didn't. It had only allowed the wound to grow deeper, festering beneath the surface. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't keep swallowing this bitterness, this quiet rage. The silence in the house grew heavier. Clarence's thoughts turned inward, his mind a whirlwind of conflict. On one hand, he was terrified of what would happen if he spoke out, of what it might cost him, of the alienation that might follow. On the other hand, he couldn't keep living this way. He couldn't keep allowing Lynette to walk all over him, to make him feel less than. Clarence closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow, steadying breath. His fingers tightened around the armrests of the chair. How long will I keep swallowing this pain? He thought. For my son, for this family. But I can't be their punching bag anymore. A flash of memory came to him, a time when things had been different. He remembered a time when he had been the head of his house, when his opinions mattered, when his voice was respected. He remembered how his wife used to smile at him with pride, how his children had looked up to him. He remembered feeling like he was worth something. But that man, that proud father, was gone now, buried under the weight of years of neglect and silence. Clarence stood up slowly, his joints creaking in protest. He walked to the kitchen where he found his son rummaging through the fridge. The young man didn't even notice him at first, too absorbed in whatever he was doing. Son, Clarence said, his voice steady but laced with the weight of years of unspoken frustration. We need to talk. His son finally turned, eyes wide in surprise. He put the carton of milk down and crossed his arms, a defensive posture already forming. What about, Dad? Clarence looked him square in the eye. I don't know how much longer I can stay here, but I've had enough of being treated like I'm invisible, like I don't matter. His son blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the statement. Clarence could see the wheels turning in his mind, the hesitation as he processed what was being said. For a moment, the room was silent. Clarence's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained calm. You're my son, but I can't keep living like this. I've worked hard for everything you have, for everything this family has, and I don't deserve to be treated like I'm nothing. For a moment, there was no response. His son opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Finally, he muttered, I don't know, Dad. I'm just busy. You know how it is. Clarence's anger flared again, but he held it in check. No, I don't know how it is, because it's always been you running away, avoiding everything while I've stayed here holding things together. You can't just keep pretending I don't exist. There was a long pause. Clarence's son shifted uncomfortably on his feet, looking everywhere but at his father. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I don't know what you want me to say, Dad. I guess you're right." The words were hollow, but they were enough to trigger something in Clarence. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Clarence stood there, he could feel the anger in him start to fade, replaced by something else, something more powerful. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could take control of his own life again. The house felt quieter today. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Clarence sat in his worn armchair, his fingers gently tapping on the armrest as his thoughts began to race. The emotional turbulence from the past few days hadn't yet settled, but today he felt a different kind of strength bubbling within him. The anger that had simmered for so long had shifted into something else, something quieter, more controlled. The kind of resolve that only comes when you've had enough. It was the kind of resolve that didn't demand a fight, but stood firm, silent, yet undeniable. He knew what he had to do, and today it was no longer a question of if, but when. He had spent so many years just trying to keep the peace, to appease everyone else, to stay out of the way and not make waves. But this time Clarence was done with that. The years of quiet submission had worn him thin, but now, in the quiet of this house that no longer felt like home, he was ready to take back control. Clarence's morning routine had been deliberate, slow. He moved through the house with purpose, every action, every step calculated. His thoughts were steady, methodical, like someone preparing for something important. There was a weight to the air, a tension that had settled into the very walls. He had made his decision. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt like a prison. As he sipped his coffee, his mind drifted back to the confrontation with Lynette. He had held his tongue then, swallowing his pride for the sake of avoiding conflict. But that had been the last time. The last time he would let her walk all over him. The last time he would sit idly by, letting the years slip away while his family treated him as though he was invisible. Clarence couldn't remember when things had shifted. When had he gone from being the man who commanded respect to the man who was dismissed at every turn? He had raised his son with love, with discipline, teaching him to be strong, to stand up for himself, and yet now he was the one who had been silenced. The internal struggle weighed heavily on him. The desire to speak up, to demand his due was fierce. But so was the fear that his son would turn away from him, that his family would finally decide that his presence was no longer needed. He feared that, in standing up for himself, he would lose everything that had once been his world. But then, in the silence of the house, Clarence realized something. He wasn't living for their approval anymore. He wasn't just sitting here waiting for them to decide what he was worth. No, this was his life. He had given so much of it to them, to his family, and now he would give something back to himself, his dignity, his self-respect. Clarence stood up, setting his empty coffee cup down with steady hands. His body felt lighter, his resolve strengthening. He was no longer going to hide in the shadows of his own life. He moved to the kitchen where Lynette was finishing breakfast. She didn't look up as he entered, too busy with whatever she had on her mind. Clarence took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, and he spoke. "I'm not a burden." His voice was calm, steady, not a hint of hesitation. "I've given more to this family than you'll ever know, and I'm done being treated like I don't matter." Lynette paused, her hands stilling as she turned to face him. The surprise in her eyes was almost amusing to Clarence, but he didn't allow himself to smile. He wasn't here to be liked, and he wasn't here for her to apologize. This wasn't about that. It was about him, about his life, his future. Lynette's face hardened, the anger flashing in her eyes, but Clarence didn't back down. "You can't just keep pushing me around. I won't stay quiet anymore." The tension in the room grew thick, suffocating. Lynette opened her mouth to speak, but Clarence raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you that I will not be silent anymore. I'm done pretending that I don't deserve more than this." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Clarence could hear the soft thrum of his heartbeat in his ears, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had done it. He had spoken his truth. He had let it be known that he was no longer the passive man he once was. But the victory felt empty. It wasn't the loud, satisfying triumph he had expected. Instead, there was just the quiet weight of his own words hanging in the air. It felt like the calm before the storm. As Clarence walked away from the kitchen, his mind drifted to the past. The times when he had been respected, when his family had looked up to him. The memories of his wife, his children as young ones, laughing and playing without a care. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago. Now the contrast was sharp. He wondered when things had started to slip away. When had he become invisible to them? I was once someone to be proud of, he thought, his heart heavy with loss. When did I become the man I am now? He knew the answer deep down. It had been a slow erosion, a gradual fading of his place in the family. But now, Clarence was done with fading. He was done with silence. He was done with being invisible. As the evening sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the room, Clarence made another decision. He picked up the phone and dialed his son's number. It rang twice before his son picked up. "Dad?" "Meet me," Clarence said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." His son hesitated. Clarence could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "About what?" "About everything," Clarence replied. "About the family. About me." About you. We need to have a real conversation." There was a long silence on the other end. Then his son finally said, "All right, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Clarence hung up, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. This was his chance. The beginning of something new. He didn't know what would come of it, but he knew it was a step in the right direction. The sun had risen high by the time Clarence made his way through the house. It was a late morning, and the heavy weight of his decision hung on him like a storm cloud. He could feel it in the air, the tension that had been building for days. The air in his home had changed. It no longer felt like a place of refuge, but a battleground. Each corner a reminder of what he had endured, and each moment a reminder of the man he used to be. The man he was about to reclaim. The past few days had left Clarence more than shaken. They had changed him. He wasn't the same man who had quietly accepted his place in this family, and he wasn't going to let his silence be mistaken for weakness any longer. The time for patience had passed. He had swallowed enough of his pride, too much of his dignity. Now his soul was simmering with a quiet resolve that no one could ignore. Clarence walked into the kitchen. The smell of Lynette's morning coffee filled the air, but it was her presence that made him pause. She was standing at the counter, flipping through a stack of papers, her back turned to him. The indifference in the way she moved, in the way she acted as if he didn't exist, was enough to fuel his growing frustration. For the first time, Clarence wasn't just angry. He was determined. The quiet rage that had been building up inside him for months was now turning into something he could no longer suppress. It was time to stand his ground. He took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen, his footsteps purposeful but controlled. Clarence hadn't planned to confront Lynette today. But life didn't always give you a choice. The way she'd belittled him, the way she'd treated him like a burden, that wasn't something he could ignore anymore. Lynette turned when she heard his footsteps, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of him standing tall, a silent determination written on his face. "What do you want, Clarence?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air. Clarence didn't flinch. He'd grown used to her hostility, but today it felt different. Today he wasn't going to be the passive, defeated man he had once been. "I've been silent for too long," he said, his voice steady but firm, "and I'm done pretending it's okay." Her eyes flickered with surprise, but she quickly masked it with a sneer. "Pretending? You think you've been a part of this family? You think you've been anything but a burden?" Clarence could feel the old, familiar sting of her words, but this time it didn't break him. Instead, something inside him hardened. He wasn't going to let her win this battle. Not anymore. "I've given more to this family than you'll ever know," he said, his tone cool but edged with conviction. "And I'm not going to let you treat me like I don't matter. Not anymore." Lynette's face contorted with anger. She stepped closer to him, trying to intimidate him, but Clarence stood his ground. He was no longer afraid of her. The years of fear, of silence, had come to an end. "You think you can just waltz in here and start demanding respect? You're nothing but a parasite, Clarence." She spat, her words venomous. The insult hit, but Clarence didn't back down. He had heard worse over the years. Her words were just that, words, and they no longer had the power to control him. "You can call me whatever you want," he replied calmly, "but I'm done being your punching bag. I won't stay quiet any longer." The room fell into a heavy silence. Lynette stared at him, her eyes blazing with fury. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment when Clarence realized that he wasn't just reclaiming his place in the family. He was reclaiming his dignity. He turned away from her, but the quiet defiance in his stance spoke louder than any words ever could. He had made his stand, and he knew that this was just the beginning. Clarence walked toward the living room, his thoughts racing. The confrontation with Lynette had been hard, but it wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part would be dealing with his son. Clarence had been waiting for this moment, for the chance to speak the truth to the one person who could change everything, his son. He had stayed silent for years, hoping his son would see through the dysfunction and recognize the truth, but that hadn't happened. Now, it was up to him to make sure his son understood. He picked up the phone and dialed his son's number. The ring echoed through the quiet house, and with each passing second, Clarence's resolve grew stronger. When his son picked up, Clarence didn't waste any time. "Son, I need to talk to you. Meet me, please." There was a pause on the other end. Clarence's heart beat faster, but he didn't let it show. "About what, Dad?" his son asked, his voice laced with confusion. "About everything," Clarence said. "About this family, about what's been going on. You need to see the truth." The line was silent for a moment, and then his son finally said, "All right, I'll be there in 20 minutes." Clarence hung up the phone, his mind already racing with the words he would say. He had no idea how this conversation would go, but one thing was certain. He couldn't stay silent anymore. His family had to understand. It was time to stand his ground, to make sure that they saw him for who he was. He glanced back toward the kitchen, where Lynette still stood, fuming. She hadn't given up, but neither had he, and this time he wouldn't be the one to back down. The time for silence had passed. Clarence sat in the living room, his eyes tracing the familiar, worn-out lines of the couch where he had spent so many quiet nights. The room that once held laughter and conversation now felt like a cage. It was late afternoon, and the sunlight barely filtered through the blinds, casting long, shadowy lines across the floor. The air was heavy with unsaid words, tension thick in every corner of the house. He had made up his mind. This was the moment that would define everything. His fingers drummed lightly on the arm of the chair, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The confrontation with Lynette had been long overdue, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about him. It was about reclaiming the respect and dignity that had been stripped away piece by piece, year after year. He had been quiet, patient, waiting for things to get better. But this had gone on long enough. No more silence. No more pretending. Clarence had come to realize that the longer he stayed silent, the more his family saw him as nothing but a shadow. But shadows, he thought, can fade or rise in the light. Today, he was going to rise. He wasn't going to beg for his place in this family. He was going to take it back. The cost didn't matter anymore. His dignity was worth fighting for. He stood and walked toward the kitchen, where the sound of Lynette's voice filtered through the walls. It wasn't the warmth of a home that greeted him. It was the cold, unyielding tone of someone who felt she had nothing to lose. Clarence wasn't sure what Lynette expected of him. He had taken so much, been pushed so low, but he wasn't that man anymore. Clarence took a deep breath as he crossed the threshold into the kitchen. Lynette was standing by the counter, her back to him, looking at her phone. For a moment, the silence between them was deafening. He could feel her presence, like the calm before a storm, her every movement calculated to show him his place. But today, it wasn't going to work. "Clarence," she said without turning around, "what do you want?" Her voice was laced with an edge, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't scared of her anymore. The years of holding his tongue, of letting her control the narrative, were over. "I want to speak my piece," Clarence said, his voice low but firm. "I've had enough." Lynette turned, a sarcastic smile playing on her lips. "Enough of what, Clarence? You've been a quiet guest in this house for years. What makes you think today is any different?" Clarence stepped forward, his body a calm contrast to the storm raging inside him. "I'm not a guest, and I'm not going to be a punching bag anymore. You think I don't see what you're doing? The manipulation, the disrespect? It's been enough." Lynette scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, now you're going to lecture me." You're nothing but a burden, Clarence. That's all you've ever been. A burden. The words hit harder than they should have, but Clarence didn't let it show. His anger was there, but it was controlled. This was the breaking point. This was the moment when everything changed. I've given more to this family than you'll ever know, Clarence said, his voice even but laced with the weight of years of sacrifice. And you know what? I'm done letting you treat me like I'm invisible. Lynette's face twisted with disbelief. She took a step closer to him, her voice sharp. You think you can just walk in here and act like you matter? Like you're something more than a burden? You don't belong here anymore, Clarence. The venom in her words stung, but Clarence stood his ground. I'm not going anywhere, Lynette. I don't need your approval to be here. This is my home, too. You don't get to make me feel like I don't belong. The room was thick with tension. Clarence's words had been simple, but they held power. Lynette's smirk faded as the reality of his defiance set in. For the first time in years, Clarence was no longer the man who took the insults in silence. He was the man who would fight for his right to be seen and respected. Suddenly the door opened, and Clarence's son walked in, looking between them with a confused frown. He hadn't seen the full extent of the tension between Clarence and Lynette, but now he could feel it. Dad, Lynette, what's going on here? His son's voice was uncertain, trying to mediate, to ease the rising storm. Clarence didn't look at his son. His focus was still on Lynette. You see what's been going on. You've let her treat me like I'm nothing, and I've taken it. But no more. No more silence. No more being a shadow in my own home. Lynette glared at Clarence, trying to salvage the situation. You're overreacting. This isn't about respect. This is about you being too proud to accept the truth. You've overstayed your welcome. Clarence's son opened his mouth to speak, but Clarence held up a hand, silencing him. Don't speak for her. She's the one who's made this house feel like a prison. I'm not asking for her permission anymore. I'm done. His son hesitated, looking between the two of them. Clarence could see the confusion in his eyes, the loyalty to his wife still holding him back. But there was a flicker of realization. The scales were falling from his eyes. Dad, I didn't know. I didn't see it. His son's voice was heavy with guilt. I'm sorry. Clarence finally looked at him, his gaze steady but filled with emotion. It's not just about seeing it, son. It's about doing something about it. I've been quiet for far too long, letting this dysfunction fester. I'm done pretending everything's okay. The weight of those words hung in the air as Lynette's face twisted with fury. You think you can just walk in here and act like I'm the problem? You think you can turn him against me? She spat. Clarence met her gaze, his eyes unyielding. I'm not here to turn anyone against anyone, Lynette. I'm here to stand my ground, and I'm not going anywhere. The house was quieter than usual. The usual hum of the TV in the background, the sound of dishes clinking, had been replaced by an oppressive stillness. The kitchen, which had once seen so many family dinners, felt empty now. Clarence stood at the counter, staring down at the letter in his hand. His fingers trembled slightly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The letter was simple, but it was everything he needed to say. The pain, the frustration, the years of silent sacrifice, it all spilled out onto the paper. He had reached a point where there was no turning back. His heart beat steadily as he read the letter for what felt like the 100th time. He had never been one for confrontation, but that man was gone now. The silence he had once borne with patience was now a ticking clock, one that would finally go off and shatter everything. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was to come, but he knew he could no longer live in this tension. The family that once seemed so whole, so intact, was fractured beyond repair, and now it was time for him to speak. I've lived too long in silence, letting everyone decide my fate. Not anymore, Clarence muttered under his breath. He folded the letter, placed it on the counter, and took a deep breath. Today, everything would change. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Clarence's son stepped in, his face filled with hesitation. Clarence didn't need to hear the words to know what was coming. He'd seen it before, the guilt, the torn loyalty between his wife and father. His son still wasn't ready to face the truth. Dad, we need to talk, his son said, his voice tentative, unsure. Clarence turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes burning with years of unspoken words. You've been running my life for far too long. Now I'll have my say. His son flinched, as if the weight of Clarence's words hit him harder than he anticipated. Clarence watched him carefully, noting the way his son's eyes darted between him and the letter on the counter. This was it, the moment when he would either see the truth or continue living in denial. Clarence had made peace with whatever was coming. But his son, he wasn't so sure. I didn't know it was this bad, his son murmured, his voice quiet, filled with regret. I didn't see it. Clarence's voice softened slightly, though his resolve didn't waver. I tried to make you see, but you wouldn't listen. All this time you've let her treat me like nothing. You've allowed me to be invisible in my own family. The words stung, but they were the truth. And for the first time in years, Clarence was free to say them out loud. He'd been a shadow for so long, a shadow that everyone walked past. But today, he wasn't just going to let it go. Before his son could respond, the door slammed open and Lynette stormed into the kitchen. Her eyes locked on Clarence, filled with fury and disbelief. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cold and sharp. Clarence didn't flinch. "I'm done being silent, Lynette. I've had enough. You won't control me anymore, not today." Lynette's lips twisted into a scornful smile. "You think you can just waltz in here and act like you have the right to speak up? You've been a burden all these years. What's changed now? You're too old for this, Clarence. You should have accepted your place long ago." Her words were like daggers, but Clarence's resolve only hardened. His son's presence, caught between them, made the situation even more tense. But Clarence wasn't backing down. "I'm not going to be your punching bag anymore, Lynette," Clarence said, his voice calm but filled with power. "I've spent enough years being your shadow, and I'm done." Lynette stepped closer, her anger flaring. "You're out of line. You have no idea what you're doing. You're too proud for your own good, Clarence. You've overstayed your welcome, and now you want to ruin everything." Clarence stood tall, feeling the weight of years of pain lift with every word he spoke. "I don't need your permission to exist in my own house. You think you can control me? You're wrong." His son watched, his face a mix of confusion and realization. The guilt he had carried for so long seemed to shift. He could no longer ignore the manipulation that had been happening right under his nose. "Dad, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I didn't see it." Clarence's heart ached as he looked at his son, but his resolve didn't falter. He had spent too many years being silent for peace's sake. Now he was ready to fight for what was rightfully his. "It's not about seeing it, son. It's about doing something about it." Lynette stood there, her face twisted in anger, trying to regain control of the situation. But the power dynamic had shifted. Clarence wasn't the man who would cower under her gaze anymore. "I won't be your punching bag anymore. You want me out?" Clarence continued, his voice steady. "Fine, but I'm going out on my terms." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Clarence could feel it in his bones. There was no turning back now. His son's gaze flickered from him to Lynette and back again. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and with that, Clarence knew that from this point on, things would never be the same. The house was still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The only light in the living room came from the dim lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the furniture. It was late, and Clarence sat by the window, staring out into the night. His reflection in the glass was the only thing he could see clearly, the rest of the world outside swallowed by the darkness. But his mind was far from empty. The weight of everything that had led to this moment was heavy on his shoulders. He knew that the confrontation was coming, that there was no avoiding it now. He wasn't afraid anymore, not like he used to be. Fear had kept him quiet for so long, but now it was just a lingering whisper, nothing more. He had lived for too long under the shadow of others' control, his son, Lynette. They had manipulated him, made him believe that he didn't have a voice. But now he knew the truth. His silence had been the chain around his neck, and tonight he was breaking free. His daughter's words echoed in his mind. "You have to be ready, Dad, for everything. This could change everything." She had urged him to be careful, to not let his anger push him too far. But Clarence had made up his mind. He was tired of being the quiet one, the one who accepted things just to keep the peace. Peace had never been for him. Not really. It had been a lie, a quiet agreement to be invisible. The door to the living room creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned, and there stood his son, hesitant, unsure. Clarence felt a pang in his chest, but he knew this moment had to come. His son had been caught in the middle for too long, but Clarence had made his choice. He wasn't going to live in the shadow of his son's indecision anymore. "You ready for this?" Clarence's voice was steady, though it came with an edge that wasn't there before. His son didn't respond right away, just stood there, looking at him like he didn't know who Clarence was anymore. "Dad, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do," his son said, his voice cracking. "I can't keep choosing sides." Clarence's gaze never wavered. "You've been silent too. You let her control everything, let her tear this family apart. You could have stood up for me, but you didn't." The words hit harder than he expected. His son winced, but it was too late for regret now. Clarence's heart hardened, and the rage he had held inside for so long started to boil over. "I'm done with being quiet," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm done letting anyone decide who I am, what I deserve." His son took a step back like he was trying to process everything. The silence between them felt like a canyon, too wide to cross. But before either of them could speak again, Lynette's voice cut through the tension. "You're still going on about this?" Lynette stepped into the room, her tone dripping with condescension. "You don't have the right to do this, Clarence. You think your little rebellion is going to change anything? You're too old to be acting like this." Clarence felt his jaw tighten. She had always been able to push him to the edge, to make him feel like he was nothing. But not now. Not anymore. "I've had enough. You've used me for far too long," he said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "I'm not your puppet, Lynette. And I won't be anymore." Lynette's face twisted in anger, but it wasn't the same. The look on her face wasn't the control she used to have. It was panic. "You'll regret this, Clarence. You really think you can walk away from everything? You've got no choice but to stay." Clarence took a step forward, his resolve unwavering. "I've made my choice," he said, his voice calm but powerful. "I'm done being treated like nothing. If you can't respect me, then I'll leave." His son was silent for a long moment, the weight of the words sinking in. Clarence could see the conflict in his eyes. He had always been torn between his loyalty to his wife and his father, but this was different. Clarence wasn't backing down, and now his son had to decide where he stood. "I don't know what to do, Dad," his son finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted things to be like this." Clarence met his son's gaze, unblinking. "It's too late for I don't know," he said. "You either stand with me or you stand with her. But don't expect me to wait around while you make up your mind. I've given all I can." Lynette stepped forward, trying to regain control of the conversation. "You're pushing him away," she spat, her voice shrill. "You're pushing him into making the wrong choice." Clarence didn't flinch. "The wrong choice is staying silent," he said, his voice steady. "The wrong choice is living in a lie, and I'm done with it." The room was thick with tension, every word a finality. Clarence had made his stand, and there was no going back. But as he stood there, the silence stretching between him and his son, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would his son choose Lynette? Would this rift break the family apart for good? The answer would come soon, but for now, all Clarence could do was wait. His son stood motionless, torn between the woman he had married and the man who had raised him. The choice hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, as Clarence waited for his son to make the decision that would change everything. "Dad," his son said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't." The living room was dim, the quiet only broken by the occasional creak of floorboards beneath the weight of a heavy moment. Clarence sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped in front of him, his mind swirling with everything that had led to this moment. The weight of years of silence, of concessions, of letting others dictate his worth, pressed on him. But tonight, the weight was different. Tonight, it was a burden he was willing to cast aside. He stared at the floor for a long time, reflecting on the choices he had made, the silence he had endured, and the way it had shaped him. But now, in this room, the past had no place. It was about the future, his future. He had no illusions left. This confrontation would either break his family beyond repair, or it would be the beginning of something new. Either way, Clarence had no intention of walking away from the truth anymore. The air was thick with tension. His daughter, standing by the door, was the only one who hadn't yet spoken. She'd been the one to listen when he couldn't speak, the one who understood that peace could never come at the cost of dignity. "I'm ready," Clarence muttered, more to himself than anyone else in the room. His daughter nodded, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. "Whatever happens, Dad, we've got to be honest now." At that moment, the door opened and Lynette walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Her eyes were narrowed, her lips tight. She was ready for the fight, Clarence could tell, but it was different this time. The confidence she had worn like armor for so long seemed to be cracking. "Clarence, I know what you're doing," Lynette said, her voice cold. "You're throwing everything away. You'll regret this, you know. Everything I've done, everything I've given to this family, you want to ruin that for your pride?" Clarence didn't flinch. "I've lived in your shadow long enough," he said, "and I've had enough. If you can't see me for who I am, then I'll walk away from this no matter the cost." Lynette's face twisted, but there was something else in her eyes now. Fear. The kind of fear that only came when the person you've been manipulating finally stood up. "You really think you can just walk away?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You think you can just make demands and expect me to bow down to you? This family is mine. I built it, I maintained it, and now you—" Clarence's voice cut through her words like a blade. "I'm done letting you control my life. I've let you manipulate me long enough. You want to keep using me to get what you want? Not anymore." Lynette recoiled, taken aback by the fire in his voice. She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped, her eyes shifting to the figure in the doorway. Their son. He had been silent up until now, standing frozen, caught between the two of them, torn in a way that made the air feel suffocating. He was a man who had lived in the middle, unable to see clearly, too afraid to pick a side. But now, the weight of Clarence's words had reached him. "Dad," the son said, his voice thick with emotion, I can't keep pretending this is okay. I've been quiet for too long." Clarence looked at him, his eyes calm but firm. "You've been silent because you were scared. Scared to lose her. Scared to lose me. But at some point you have to choose the truth over the lie." The son swallowed hard, stepping into the room, his gaze flicking back and forth between his father and his wife. "I've been trying to keep the peace, trying to avoid making a decision, but it's too much now. I can't keep doing this." Lynette's expression faltered, and she turned to him with desperation in her eyes. "You're not going to let him talk to you like this. He's been nothing but trouble, and now he wants to ruin everything. You can't—" The son held up his hand, silencing her. "I can't keep being in the middle anymore. I'm tired of being torn. I choose the truth." He looked directly at Clarence. "I choose you, Dad." Clarence's heart swelled with relief, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. There was still the matter of Lynette. "You're making a mistake," Lynette hissed, her voice venomous. "You think this is the answer? You'll lose everything. You'll lose me." Clarence stood tall, his back straight, the power of his decisions surging through him. "I've already lost everything that mattered. I'm not living like this anymore. Not for you, not for anyone. I'm done." Lynette's eyes filled with a mix of rage and disbelief, but Clarence's resolve was unshaken. He had made his decision. And it wasn't just about walking away from her. It was about walking away from the lies that had kept him shackled for too long. "I'm leaving," Clarence said, his voice steady. "This family may never be the same, but I can't stay here anymore. Not in this place, not with these people who've forgotten who I am." The son stood in stunned silence as his father turned and walked toward the door. He didn't call out. He didn't stop him. His eyes followed Clarence's every move, the weight of the finality of it all pressing on his chest. "Dad, don't go. I'm sorry," the son said, his voice breaking. But Clarence didn't look back. He was done with the silence. He was done with the manipulation. He was done being a pawn in a game that wasn't his to play. As the door clicked shut behind him, the son stood there paralyzed by the choice he had made. The living room felt heavier than usual. The echoes of the past had settled into every corner, yet the silence between the walls seemed to whisper the unspoken truth. Clarence was gone. His absence left a void, one that neither Lynette nor the children could fill. It had been days since he walked out, and now it was as if the family was standing at the edge of something they didn't fully understand. Clarence, in his absence, had made his stand clear. There would be no going back. And while his daughter tried to keep the peace, her eyes told the story of what was lost. Clarence had made his choice, and though it felt like the end of something, it also felt like the beginning of something else, something better for him. But for the family, the question now was, could they find their way back to one another, or was the fracture too deep? Clarence's son, standing by the window, looked out into the night, his mind still spinning from the decision he had made. He had chosen his father, but the choice didn't feel like a victory. It was more like a wound, still raw and deep. He had expected clarity, but instead he was left with the weight of responsibility, unsure how to navigate the fallout. His wife, Lynette, had been quiet all day, her eyes narrowed, her mind working overtime to find a way to fix this. But deep down, she knew something had shifted in her. She had pushed Clarence for so long, controlled every aspect of the family's life, and now, the control she so desperately clung to had slipped through her fingers, and there was no getting it back. As the family gathered, the tension in the room was palpable. Clarence's daughter, standing by her father's empty chair, was the first to break the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a sorrow in it. "We can't go back," she said softly, "but we can move forward. It's time to find our way through this, together." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It wasn't just about the past, it was about the future, and the future they all knew was uncertain. Clarence's son turned to face Lynette. His eyes were pained, filled with regret. The silence between them had stretched for so long that it seemed impossible to bridge, but now, standing at the crossroads, he knew what he had to do. "I was too afraid to make a choice," he admitted, his voice cracking. "And in doing that, I hurt everyone. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Lynette." The apology hung between them, thick with emotion. Lynette, who had always prided herself on her control, didn't know how to react. The anger and frustration she had held on to for so long seemed to melt away, but so did her power. "I've always had to control everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but now I see that I've been controlling the wrong things." For the first time, Lynette's defenses seemed to crumble, but her admission wasn't enough to heal the damage. Her eyes met her son's, filled with a vulnerability that no one had ever seen before. "I've lost myself in trying to hold it all together," she confessed, her voice breaking. "But now I don't know who I am without that control." Clarence's daughter watched her mother, her heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. The room was filled with raw honesty, but there was no easy solution, no quick fix. "We can't undo the past," she said softly, "but we have to choose what comes next." Clarence had made his choice. He was done being a pawn in their game. He had left, and now it was time to move forward. "I'm done living for anyone else's expectations," he said, his voice firm but calm. "If you want peace, we all need to change. If you want things to be different, then we have to let go of the old ways." The family stood at a crossroads. Clarence's decision had been made. His future was his own, free from the shadows that had loomed over him for so long. But for Lynette, for his son, and for his daughter, the path ahead was uncertain. The weight of their actions, of the choices they had made, was something they couldn't ignore. And in that moment, as they all looked at one another, they knew that healing couldn't come without sacrifice. Lynette's eyes darted between her husband and her son, her mind racing. She could feel the walls closing in around her, but there was nothing left to say. The time for manipulation had passed. The time for truth had arrived. The family had to decide if they could move beyond the past or if the damage was too much to repair. Clarence's son looked at his father's empty chair and then at Lynette. His heart was heavy with regret, but also with a new understanding of what needed to happen. "We've got a long road ahead," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty, "but it's time we decide if we're going to walk it together." There was no answer. Only the heavy silence that followed as each person in the room looked inward, knowing that the decision they made now would shape their future